Good morning, everyone. What a stunning area I am in this morning. This is an area that I started exploring about 2 years ago, and I've come back each year since, and it is just wonderful out here. There's so much wildlife, and I'm out here just looking for whatever wildlife I can. And I've already been able to find a woodpecker nest this morning. It's a little family of northern flickers. The babies in there, the chicks, they're still too small where they're not poking their heads out of the nest. I just saw one of the adults go in and out, and I can hear the chicks in there. So I'll come back in a week and a half or so to check on them and see if the little ones are peeking their heads out yet. I've got some marmots up here in this little boulder rock field. They're just watching me as I do my video here, running around the rocks and everything. So there's just so much wildlife in this area. I've seen some pika, some mule deer. It's just so beautiful out here. If you've seen any of my videos before, you probably know that I love getting out into more backcountry areas like this when I observe and photograph wildlife. But that's not to say that all of my wildlife photography is in areas like this. If a situation arises that's a little bit closer to home, I will jump all over it and capitalize on those scenarios as well. So that's what this week's video is about. There's a fox den that I recently was able to photograph in a location a little bit closer to home. And so that's what I wanted to review in this week's video. And I'll let you know here why I didn't film that video at the actual fox den. I'll go over a few of the pros and the cons of photographing the scenario that I'm going to review with you guys, and give you guys a couple things to remember when photographing a fox den like this. So to start off, let me just explain to you guys why I did this video a little bit different than my others. Generally in my videos, I like to take you guys along for as much of the journey as possible, whether it's finding the wildlife and then taking you guys along as I photograph the wildlife. And I like to document that whole process, show you guys how I'm finding the animals, and you know, just take you guys along for as much of that as possible. This video, I didn't do that. And the reason being was, as I mentioned before, this red fox den was a little bit closer to home than most of the wildlife that I photographed. And when I say closer to home, what I mean is this fox den was literally in town in the middle of a field. And that general area tends to be a lot more chaotic, a lot more busy and noisy than these areas that I generally photograph in. And for that reason, I didn't do this video out in that location. It was just too noisy, too chaotic for me. So for that reason, I'm doing this video out here, and I'll kind of take you guys back in time and show you guys these foxes and review with you the whole process and some of the things to remember when photographing a den like this. As I mentioned before, I love getting out into more backcountry areas like this when looking for wildlife to find and photograph. These are some of my favorite areas to look for wildlife in, to photograph. They're just pristine, beautiful areas, and I absolutely love it. That being said, there are some real benefits that come along with photographing wildlife in an area like the area that this red fox den was in. The main benefit in my mind when photographing wildlife in areas such as this is they tend to be much more habituated to humans than wildlife that you would see and find out here. Those red foxes, for example, were incredibly habituated to people for the most part. Those young kits quickly became used to humans in the area, which made it so much easier to photograph them and watch them. The dog fox, or father fox, as well, was very habituated to people. He was very used to people, and it was incredibly easy to photograph him. He would come in and visit the kits regularly, and it was just very easy to photograph them. The vixen, or mother fox, on the other hand, was not used to people. She did not like people, and she became very uncomfortable when any humans or any vehicles were in the area, and she would approach the den. And if she would see people or vehicles there, she would turn around and leave the area. And that's something I'll touch on a little bit later on in this video. For the most part though, those foxes were very habituated to people, which made it incredibly easy and convenient to photograph them. It was very refreshing to be able to photograph a family of red foxes so easily. Another benefit of photographing a fox den in an area like this is just the convenience and accessibility of that den. That den was located in a spot where I could check on them throughout the day, multiple times throughout the day if I wanted to, and it was so convenient to just be able to pull up in my vehicle and photograph them. Incredibly convenient. If I were to photograph a red fox den in a backcountry area like this, that's something I wouldn't be able to do, but to be able to just pull up and be relatively close and photograph them multiple times throughout the day was so convenient. And it's so nice when you can find a den that you're able to do that. The third main benefit to photographing a den like this is that you don't need to set up a photography blind in order to do so. In my area, the red foxes in the more backcountry areas are incredibly wary of people. They're still trapped, they're still hunted, and because of that, they are incredibly wary of human activity. So those dens that I find in the backcountry, anytime I find one, I need to set up a photography blind in order to photograph them. And in order to set up that blind, I have to do so. I have to get in and get out, set it up without being seen or detected by those foxes. Anytime I want to photograph that family of foxes, I have to get in and get out, and my entire time there photographing them, again, I have to remain unseen and undetected by those foxes. If they know that there's a human around their den, they will move that den, and it becomes incredibly difficult to find them again. Not to mention the stress that just puts on that family of foxes. So it's quite the chore to photograph a red fox family in a more backcountry area like this. So to not have to worry about that at this particular fox den was so nice. It took such a load of stress off of me as I went in and was able to photograph these foxes again multiple times a day if I wanted to. It was so nice. Years ago, when I was first getting into wildlife photography, I was fortunate enough to find a red fox den in a backcountry area like this, very remote area, and it was nice to be able to get in and get out undetected by those foxes with my blind to photograph them for multiple days. It was a whole lot of fun, and there was one day I decided to watch the den more from a distance just to see if their behavior was any different than what I had noticed it was being closer in that blind. And that day I was watching them with my binoculars from quite a ways away, and two turkey hunters came into the area, and they were making their way around the den. And before they were too close, one of the adults had called the kits back into the den, and so the kits ran back into the den, and that adult stayed hidden there in the vegetation and was just watching these turkey hunters. And I don't know what they saw in that area, but they were looking at something around the den. I don't know if they noticed one of the foxes or what it was, but the adult was just hiding there. The kits were in the den. The hunters eventually made their way out of the area, and you could tell that the adult was just stressed. It kept going and looking in the direction of the hunters, and it just looked very stressed. The next time that I returned to that area, I could not find those foxes again, and I never saw any of those foxes, the adults, the kids, never saw them again. That den has not been used since, and it's just shows how incredibly difficult it can be to photograph these foxes in a backcountry area such as that versus a more populated area such as this den that I photographed this spring. And so it was just very refreshing to be able to photograph again these foxes this year in a more populated area versus a backcountry area like this. So as we've talked about, there's some real benefits that come along with photographing a fox den or any wildlife really in a more populated area like the one that I photographed this fox den in. Adversely, there are some things that I don't really like as much photographing wildlife in areas like this. First thing is, I'm not in a stunning area like I am right now. As I mentioned, I just love being out here. It's so peaceful. It's a reset for me mentally to get out in areas like this and photograph wildlife. So that's the main thing that I dislike about photographing wildlife in a scenario like that fox den was in. Another thing that I don't like so much about photographing wildlife in these areas that we're talking about is you're generally limited on the angle that you can photograph them from. This fox den, for example, there was really only one angle that I could photograph the den from. And it made it really difficult to get images at certain times of the day, so it really stretched me to use my creativity when coming up with ideas for images that I wanted of these foxes. And it was really good for me to again, exercise that creativity and come up with those more creative images. But at the same time, there were some angles of that den that I would have loved to have been able to photograph. I just wasn't able to due to the nature of that property that those foxes were on. That being said, I feel like I did make the most of that scenario, of the elements that I had to work with, and I feel like I was able to come up with some fun and creative images. If you're interested at all on what I did for some of those images, my thought process in getting those pictures, go check out a video that I came out with a couple weeks ago where I explain the whole process and give you a couple tips of some things that you can do when the scenario that you have to work with isn't ideal. Some fun and creative ways that you can use the light and whatnot. Go check that video out. Another thing that I don't like so much about photographing wildlife in areas like this is the people. Please don't take that the wrong way. Please don't assume that I'm some huge antisocial person that just dislikes everybody else, because that is not true at all. I love getting out with other photographers on occasion and photographing wildlife. I love getting to know new people, and I love making new friends. The reason that I generally don't like photographing around other people, though, is more internal. There's something about me, I can't be as creative in my photography when there are people watching me. It's something that's just really weird about me. I don't know what it is, but it's really hard for me to make creative and fun images when I'm being watched by other people. I know, it's just something really weird. It's something I have to get over, but for the time being, the easy way that I found to get over that is to just go out by myself and do my own thing. Plus, I do like my alone time. I love just being out here with nature by myself. It's something I've always craved as well. And so I generally just don't get out with other people. The thing that's hardest for me, though, about photographing around other people is that it is incredibly difficult for me to see the photographers that just care about getting their image rather than doing what is best for the wildlife. And that is something that I saw a lot at this red fox den. Most of the examples were amazing, and I'm going to go into those in a little bit, but there were a couple examples that were just really hard for me to watch. The structure of this fox den was very interesting in that there were multiple large dens within a pretty immediate area. And these kits, there were so many of them that they couldn't all fit into one of these dens, so they would spread out between these 3 or 4 different dens, and they would just kind of hop back and forth between dens. It was pretty fun to watch. But one of these dens was a lot closer to where people would park than the other ones. And these kits, they got very used to the vehicles there, the people in the vehicles taking pictures. But anytime anybody would leave those vehicles and walk around or approach them, any of the kits in that closer den, they did not like that at all. They would become scared, they would hide in those dens, and they wouldn't come out. One morning I was photographing these foxes, and there were these 2 other guys there photographing it, and they'd gotten out of their vehicle, they had approached much closer than they probably should have. And the kits that were stuck in that closer den, they would not come out. They were scared to come out. These guys eventually came back up to reposition themselves, and I just let them know, hey, The mother fox, just so you guys know, she won't come in to feed these kits, to nurse these kits, if there's people out walking around, and sometimes even if there's people in their cars. And while I was still talking, one of the guys just scoffed and shook his head and walked away, and the other guy just said, well, it doesn't matter because the dad's coming in to feed them, and then he just walked away and repositioned himself. Now, that's great that the dad's coming in, he's comfortable, but that mom, like I had mentioned before, she would not come in to nurse when people were there. And again, the dad was feeding them, but those kids, they still need their mother's milk. They need to be nursed. And so that was just one of those examples that really bothered me. Those guys, they just cared about getting their pictures. They didn't care about what those little baby foxes needed. And that can be very detrimental to those foxes as they're growing, to their overall health, and to the mom as well. If she's constantly uncomfortable with people in the area, that can affect her negatively. She'll be stressed out all the time, and that's not good for her. And eventually she may just move those kits somewhere else. So it affects the photographers, it affects the people just out there to enjoy watching the foxes, and it affects, most importantly, those foxes. Now, another example, and this is something that I saw quite often, and it made me so happy to see it. There was one evening that I was there photographing those foxes, and it was getting pretty late, and I noticed that the vixen, the mother, was coming in, and she wanted to nurse those kits, but there were cars parked there, and she wouldn't come in. She would approach, and then she would turn around and leave, and she would come back and see if the cars were still there, and she would leave. And I noticed she was doing this, so one of my good friends, she was there as well, and I texted her, and I just said, hey, Mother Fox is trying to come in to feed these kits. She's not going to do so with us parked here. And my friend was awesome. Immediately, she turned on her vehicle and left the area. I did the same, and there was another lady there as well. And on my way out, I just stopped by, we rolled down our windows, and I just said, hey, just so you know, there's a mother fox, she's trying to come in to feed her kids, but she won't do it here with people. So what I recommend you do is just cross the street, get a little bit further back, watch from a distance, let her come in, nurse, she'll probably leave to go out hunting again, and then you can go back and you can get your pictures. And this lady was amazing. She said, oh, thank you so much. I have never watched foxes before. I don't know what to look for. I want to do what's best for them. Thank you for letting me know. And she immediately turned on her vehicle, crossed the street, watched as the mother came in, fed her kits, and she was still able to get her content. The mother was able to come in, feed the little ones, and all was well. And that's what I saw for the most part at this den, and it was just absolutely amazing to see those people want to learn and want to do what was best for those foxes. That always makes me so happy to see. Scenarios like this can be difficult, especially when you get that photographer out there that just cares about getting their perfect image rather than what the actual needs of the animal are that they're photographing. It can be difficult to see, and I constantly have to remind myself that those foxes out there, they don't belong to me. That land out there, it's not mine, and it's not my place to go out there and tell people what to do and what not to do, to play sheriff essentially. It's not my place to do that. I think a better way to treat those situations is to go out there and treat everybody as respectfully as we possibly can. And most importantly, to respect those animals that we're photographing and observing. Those animals will tell us what they need. They'll tell us if they're feeling uncomfortable, anxious, nervous. They'll give us cues that can tell us all those things. So as wildlife photographers, we should be able to recognize those cues and then react accordingly and immediately when we see those cues. Most of the time when I see people that are doing something that affect an animal or change its behavior in a negative way, it's because they just don't know what they're doing. And it's times like those we need to very respectfully and courteously educate on those cues to watch for and what those animals are trying to tell us. I've been on the receiving end of that before, when somebody has told me, hey, you're acting in a way that is negatively impacting this animal, and I am so grateful when people tell me stuff like that, because I don't know everything, and I'm learning just like the rest of us, and I need to know what cues to look for. So I am so grateful when people are courageous enough to let me know what I'm doing and what the animal is trying to tell me. And the time will come when we need to act by example as well, when we need to have the courage to leave a scenario because it's not good for that animal. And a lot of times people just need somebody to follow, and so the time will come when you need to lead by example, and it can be hard to do that, but it's always worth it, always worth putting that animal first. I feel like I've done so much talking in this week's video, so it's time to give you guys a break. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I hope you've enjoyed, and I hope you've enjoyed the content of these little red foxes that I was able to get and share with you guys. Such a fun species. I just love watching them play and wrestle. They're just so cute, and to be able to share that with you guys, I hope you've enjoyed. I would love to hear from you guys down in the comments. What type of wildlife photography do you prefer? Do you like the more backcountry settings like this, or do you like the more easily accessible urban settings with the more habituated wildlife? There's no right or wrong answer. Just let me know down in the comments, and I'd love to know some of the species that you've photographed in more of the populated scenarios, kind of like these red foxes that I was able to photograph. Let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you guys. Thank you so much for following along this week. I always appreciate the support. If you've enjoyed the video, give it a big thumbs up. It helps me out so much. Have a great week out there, you guys. Stay safe. We'll see you next time.